Okay, so let's talk about emissions from building electrification, or from buildings. So in California, about 25% of all of the carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions in the state comes from activity in buildings. So that's electricity generation for the buildings, and that's fossil fuels being burned in the buildings themselves. So this diagram here sort of shows you a breakdown of that. We have on the right a sort of brown cloud that's representing about 45 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent that's being emitted when we generate electricity for buildings. And then on the left, you have it split into commercial and residential buildings. And we have a blue cloud that represents the emissions from burning methane, from burning the fossil gas that's going into your house. And then we have a smaller cloud from refrigerants, which I'll talk about briefly in a second. Now, there still is emissions coming from this generation of electricity, but it's possible for that generation to be clean. And it's a huge project of the clean utilities and of the development of more power in the state to make that electricity clean. And so that's a way all of the electricity that we use can in the future have no emissions associated with it. That's obviously not true of the gas. We're burning an actual fossil fuel in your house. It's releasing carbon dioxide. It's also leaking the methane itself in small amounts out of fixtures and out of the pipe coming into your house. And that methane itself is a very powerful greenhouse gas, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. So we really want to move away from gas use. The gas is being mostly used by hot water heaters and space heaters and dryers, and it's also being used in cooking. Cooking, depending on your household and what you're doing with it, if you have a gas stove, is probably between 10 and 30% of your gas use. It's not really the majority of it, but it is something that we really care about, right? You may not care how your water is being heated or how your space is being heated, but you care about the experience you have when you cook. So we want to move to a place where we have that gas pipe flowing into your house is not active. There isn't gas coming into your house. It's not being burned. It's not leaking. That's the future that has the most potential for building decarbonization. And to get there, we're going to have to figure out how to cook without gas. So you may have some experience. Oh, also just a brief side note on these refrigerants. You might notice that there's, not a huge cloud, but these little gray clouds for refrigerants. That's the material that's in air conditioners and refrigerators that allows the compressors to work and allows them to extract heat. And even though you don't have that being piped into your house the way you do with gas and electricity, there's such strong greenhouse gases that tiny emissions just from the appliance you have in your house, at its end of life leaking, actually contributes really significantly. So if you have an older air conditioner or an older refrigerator, it's really important to get that properly recycled when you're done with it, instead of just throwing it out or putting it somewhere outside where it'll leak. So be aware for your refrigerator and your air conditioner that at its end of life, you need to get it properly recycled and the refrigerant properly disposed of. But that's not really what we're talking about today. It is really important though. So back to cooking. Most of you, if you've cooked on an electric stove, you're familiar with these things called electric resistance burners or coil burners. The way these work is that you have an electric current that produces heat in the metal coil. When electricity is forced through metal, it creates heat as a byproduct. And in an efficient conductor, like a normal wire, there's not very much heat. But in an inefficient conductor, which is what these are on purpose, most of that electrical energy gets converted to heat. So you have a very small current being forced through the coil, and that creates a lot of heat as a byproduct. This, incidentally, is how those old filament light bulbs, incandescent light bulbs, work. They have a little tiny metal filament that gets so hot because of this resistive heating that it glows bright, and that makes the light. And that's also why those light bulbs are so inefficient, because they're creating light through heat instead of just creating light directly. It's not super important why this is, but in order for these coiled burners to work properly, they have to have a high thermal mass. They have to hold a lot of heat in themselves. And that means that they're very slow to change temperature. So if you've ever used one of these, you crank it all the way up and it takes quite a while to get hot, and then you realize it's too hot and you're burning your onions or whatever, and you want to turn it down, and it doesn't get colder for a little while. So lots of people, these are actually more common than gas burners in the United States. Tons of people use them, tons of people cook very well on them. But if you really care about fine control of temperature, this is not going to be great for you, as I'm sure many of you have experienced. It is often a pain to cook on these things. But there's a much better technology that's now exists called induction, which is what we're talking about today. What a surprise that we've gotten to it. So the problem with those electric burners is that you're generating the heat in that metal coil, and that metal coil has to sort of hold a lot of heat, and then that heat goes into the pan. So ideally, you would want to generate the heat in the pan itself, right? Like, you don't care about what is hot around the pan. You care about the pan getting hot, and you care about that heating the food that's in the pan. And through a process called induction or electromagnetic induction, or there's lots of words for it, it's actually possible for current to move from one sort of piece of metal to another. If you have kind of a coil of wire and you have a current going back and forth in that, it creates this weak magnetic field that changes, and it causes metal around that magnetic field to have these little tiny currents in it called eddy currents, which are not, they're not like a strong current that's going around. You would never have it affect anything else. But like all currents in metal, it's going to generate heat. So if you have some magnetic pan, or not a magnetic pan, but a pan that has iron or ferromagnetic metals in it, then you can use a coil of wire like this to get electricity to move in the pan itself, and that generates heat directly in the pan. So you don't have anything else that you're controlling the temperature of. You're just controlling how much heat is flowing into the pan, which means if you are realizing you're burning your onions and you turn it off right away, then there's no heat other than what's held in the pan itself, and it cools down as fast as the pan possibly could. It also means that if you want to turn the temperature up really fast, or if you want a lot of power going into the pan, the heat is being created directly in the pan, and that can happen much faster than with any other form of cooking. It's kind of as fast as you could possibly imagine it happening, because the heat is being generated in the pan itself. For a context for sort of other things that use this, transformers that are on power lines use this. They have big coils of metal that are passing current from one thing to another thing and changing its properties without actually touching. What's happening here is not really like that in terms of how it actually affects the pan, because we're not getting a strong current in the pan. There's no world where it like shocks you or anything like that. But it's a process that's used all over the place. So we had a question in the chat which asks, does this heat faster than a gas burner? The simple answer is mostly yes. The more complicated answer is it depends on the power. So if you have like a massive gas burner that burns really hot and has a huge flame, then that's going to heat a pan faster because there's more heat energy total. But less of that heat energy from the gas burner is going into the pan directly. A lot of it is going out into the air. A lot of it is heating the area around the pan instead of just the pan. You can see the flame licking up the side of the pan and going elsewhere, and that's hot air and heat that's moving somewhere other than the pan. So for a gas burner and an induction burner that have the same amount of power, that have the same amount of sort of total energy flowing, the induction will always be faster because there's no waste heat that's going somewhere else or being generated somewhere else. So that's great for really carefully controlling the temperature of your food and of your cooking. And that's part of why we really like it and really advocate for it, is that you have this very direct control over the temperature and heat going into your food, and also that it's incredibly efficient. It's even more efficient than those electric resistance burners, and much more efficient than a gas burner, because there's no flame going out, and that's great. We have another question, which is, you could make the handle out of non-ferrous metal and the handle wouldn't get hot when the pan does get hot. So that's not quite right. The handle is attached to the pan, right? So heat is still going to flow through the pan into the handle the way it does on any kind of stove. If you make the handle out of non-ferrous metal, it won't get heated by the induction directly. But actually, even if you did make it out of iron, it wouldn't get heated by the induction directly, because the induction heats the area right on that contact surface. But it's not sort of projecting that magnetic field that heats stuff up and out to the side. It's only really happening right over the burner. But the handle will still get hot in the way that it always does, because it's connected to the pan, and the pan is really hot. So one thing that I want to address here is, sometimes people are worried that this doesn't sound safe, right? You're sort of beaming energy from one place to another with fields, and maybe that's going to hurt you. So one thing that I think is an interesting fact is for a refrigerator magnet, the strength of that magnetic field in the unit that people use to measure magnetic field is about 100 Gauss. And the field from an induction cooktop is about 0.2 Gauss. It's about 1,000 times weaker. So in terms of, it's not going to be sucking some metal from across the room or something like that. It's an incredibly weak magnetic field in those terms. That's a little bit misleading because the effects of the magnetic field aren't about the strength of it. They're about the fact that it's like oscillating, that it's changing back and forth very quickly. And that change back and forth does create what's called electromagnetic radiation. You can think of it as being comparable to a radio wave that's being emitted by a weak radio transmitter. But it decays very fast. If you have some kind of detector for this, you can put it right next to the burner and you can see that, oh, there's energy there. But if you move it away after a couple of feet, there's basically no energy at all. But more importantly than that, no studies have ever found any harmful effect on humans from this scale of magnetic field and this speed of oscillation. So as far as we know, it's totally safe. There is one exception to that that's very important, which is that it can affect metal and electronics. It's not going to, if you have your phone sitting next to it, it's not going to do anything to that. It's very contained right, in the burner itself. But if you have a pacemaker, which might be a really sensitive electronically, you're going to want to check with your doctor before you directly use induction. It's totally safe for you to be in the same room. It's safe for you to walk past, but you don't want to be standing right over it unless your doctor says that's okay. Now, anecdotally, the people that we know that have gotten induction, their doctors have almost universally said, it's totally fine. Your pacemaker isn't going to get affected by that. It's safe to be around induction, but you still absolutely need to check because it would be horrible if something went wrong. So that's induction overall. Now, something that I skipped here is that you need to use an iron content pan. I mentioned that earlier, but I didn't go into it. And a lot of the pans that people cook with are not already having iron content. So there's always a way to check with any pan. If you take any kind of refrigerator magnet, it doesn't have to be strong at all, and that sticks to the pan or sort of, is sucked against it, even if it's not sticking very firmly, that pan is going to work with induction. In terms of the materials that this works for, it's always going to work with cast iron and carbon steel. Those are always going to work. Stainless steel and ceramic are usually going to work. Now, that's because ceramic pots are usually ceramic around an iron base. And almost all forms of stainless steel are magnetic, although there's some sort of weird chromium alloys that aren't magnetic anymore. So you can basically always try to use these, and if they don't heat up, you might want to try the magnet check, but you should expect them to work. Then there are some kinds that will never work. So a copper-only pan, an aluminum-only pan, a transparent glass dish like Pyrex, those are not magnetic. They cannot be magnetic. There's no way that we're going to get this induction to work where it's going to heat that directly. You could imagine something where you have the induction heat like a little iron coaster and then have that heat the pan, but then you're kind of back at an electric resistance burner. It's not going to be any better than that. So those aren't going to work themselves. However, a lot of pans that are like that actually already have iron in the base. So it's very common for a copper pot, if you have a copper pot or an aluminum pot that kind of has a different color base than the sides, it's very common for there actually to be iron in there so that it has a little bit of a higher thermal mass. It sort of isn't quite going to get so hot and cold quickly, and it's going to hold heat better, but the copper or the aluminum is going to conduct the heat around the pan very well. And similarly, there are some glass pots that have, an iron coaster in the base that you can see. So for that kind of pan or pot, you're going to want to test to see if you have a magnet that can stick to it, and you might still be able to use it. But for a copper only or aluminum only pan, it's not going to work. And we had a question about the almost always and it depends pans. Might it work, but not as well? And the answer is occasionally you'll get a pan that has a very low iron content or like a strange alloy of steel that is technically magnetic, but doesn't really work very well. Usually a magnet will not stick to these at all. It's a property that you're not going to notice with the magnet. But if you put it on, you'll find out that it is getting hot, but kind of unevenly. So if you have a pan like that and you discover it heats unevenly, but you're okay with using it, then that's totally fine. But since sort of the whole point of this is that you can control the temperature really well and it's going to heat really evenly, we don't really focus that much on the edge cases of the ones that work but not very well. Mostly you're going to have pans that work perfectly well and then pans that don't work at all. Now there's, in addition to the pan limitation, there's a few cooking limitations. So there is no open flame being produced. So if you're using something that you're expecting to cook with an open flame, for example, if you're heating a tortilla directly on the burner, or if you're charring a pepper and you want the outside to be a little burned by the flame without being sort of evenly heated, you can't do that on induction. There's no flame, there's no way to do that, because the whole point is that metal is being heated instead of air. And there's no hot air that's sort of flowing up around the sides of the pan. So sometimes for some kind of tossed high heat, stir fry dishes, you want there to be a lot of heat flowing in the air around the pan. This isn't going to do that. The heat is just being generated by the pan itself. And then there's kind of one last thing that I mentioned a little bit earlier, which is that the pan has to have that kind of direct contact to the burner. So if you have a pan that has a round bottom, like a wok, or a really, really tiny, bottom, like a flat bottom wok, that's not going to heat very well because the heat is mostly going to be produced right at that contact surface. However, I have here a picture of a drop-in induction wok burner, which is a burner that has that coil in there kind of curved around the base so that you can put a round bottom wok in there and get the sides really hot and do all of the wok cooking that you're going to want to do. But that burner will only work for that wok because you can't put a flat bottom thing anymore onto it. So we have a couple of questions in here. Frying pan, like the one in the picture, might have been on an earlier slide. This one is a wok burner itself, not a pan. And then I think I just addressed the wok cooking question. We have a question for wok cooking where food needs to sear. Will the wok get hot on the bottom and sides of the wok? The answer is yes, if you have this kind of round bottomed burner that will create the heat right in all of the contact areas, and then that heat will move up the sides within the pan quite easily. But if you have a flat bottom wok that has a kind of narrow bottom and you're putting it on a flat induction burner, then it won't go up the sides as well as it would with a big flame. So all that being said, that is some downsides. It's, especially for certain kinds of cooking. There are a lot of people, these wok burners have come on the market and become a lot more common in the past few years. And there are a lot of people working on how to make, dishes that require open flames and cook with cookware that doesn't work super well on induction, and kind of developing new technologies. So if you have something that you're imagining you can't really use, or you can't really cook, then it might be good to look around and see if there's, some chef who's using induction who's figured out a way to do it, or, wait a couple of years, get your standard induction and see if a new technology develops that you can add into it that will allow you to cook that. So I've been addressing questions as we go, but we have some time now just for questions about what I've been talking about the technology itself and the limitations and what kind of pans you need. We have one more that's just come up. Does this go on top of the regular cooktop, or is it its own unit? This drop-in wok that I was just showing is its own unit, separate thing. So you kind of have one burner on your stove, or one separate burner that only really can be used with woks and can't really be used with flat bottom pans. You can get a range that has a hybrid that has both types, or you can get kind of a countertop unit. Those are both possible, but it doesn't go on top of the regular cooktop. Similarly to what I was saying before, you could kind of imagine placing some kind of bowl, on top of the cooktop that heats up the bowl that then heats up the wok. Like that's possible, but you wouldn't want to do that, because then you're losing all of the efficiency that you're getting from using induction instead of using one of those coil burners. Anybody else have any questions? Anyone want me to repeat anything or sort of dive in more to something that I've already mentioned? Is there a manufacturer that specializes in induction cookware, or is it widely available? It's now widely available. I think almost all cookware lines are going to have a lot of induction compatible cookware. There are some manufacturers that focus on branding their cookware as induction compatible, but there's also a lot of induction compatible cookware that isn't, necessarily branded that way, because it's just a steel pan or, an aluminum pan with a coaster in the bottom. So you can find almost any kind of pan that is induction compatible that people have made, either with iron in the base or out of steel or something like that. But you just have to make sure that you're looking for it and checking. And there are some kind of little symbols that people use to sort of identify induction compatible. They're not super consistently used, and there are a couple of different ones. But if you start looking for induction cookware, at a particular store, they might use one in particular. So you might be able to tell when you're looking at other cookware. There's a question, are the plug-in portable ones as good as the installed versions? I'll be talking a lot about the installed versus plug-in portable later. When I talk about how you can get this in your home. Usually the plug-in portable ones are a little bit lower power than if you get a big range. So if you want to cook a huge dish that you need a lot of heat going into, you might not be able to do it. But for most things, the plug-in portable ones are perfectly great and are going to be just as good as the installed versions. Feel free to keep thinking about questions, and we'll have more time to answer them later. And again, feel free, if you need me to clarify something I've said before, happy to go back. But now I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Michael Martin, who's here from Physicians for Social Responsibility. He's the co-chair of the Environment and Health Committee for them, and is a professor at UCSF, and is working a lot on advocating for or on spreading awareness of the indoor pollution health risks of using gas in the home that have become more and more clear in the past few years. So, Dr. Martin, I'm going to pass it over to you. Feel free to share your screen now.
Thank you, Leo. Let me get my screen. There we go. Can you see my blue screen?
I'm not able to see it yet, but I might have something strange going on.
How's it? Can you see it?
Let me try again.
Can you see it now?
Still no. Feel free to troubleshoot for a moment. I'll check on what's going on in the chat.
Okay, let me. Share. Now, can you see that screen?
Great. It's up now.
Okay, good. There we go. Okay. Thank you. Well, it's nice to be here. Nice to be able to talk to you all about this important topic, the health issues related to gas stoves, becoming more important all the time. I'm on the clinical faculty at UCSF in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, and I'm president of a group called Physicians for Social Responsibility, a Washington, D.C. based group that has been doing very good work on climate change issues. Physicians for Social Responsibility was founded in 1961, so it's a long-standing organization. It addresses primarily climate change and the risk of nuclear war, and it shared the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize for its work trying to prevent the risk of nuclear war. So it's a very distinguished and long-established organization. I'm also on the board of directors of the local Physicians for Social Responsibility chapter here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Very active group, and one that you might hear more about over the coming years. Okay, so what comes to mind when you think of gas stoves? Well, a lot of things come to mind, but some of the key ones are natural gas. Sounds pretty good, right? Natural gas. Clean energy. It's said to be clean energy by many. And cooking with gas, a phrase coined by the gas industry to help us think of gas in a positive light. But what should we think of when we're thinking of gas stoves and natural gas? Indoor air pollution. It's very, very important to realize burning things in your home is not a good idea. It creates air pollution, just like burning things outside does, or any place does. You can't necessarily see the pollution, but it's there, and it has effects, which we'll talk about. Health risks is another thing which you should come to mind when you think of gas stoves. There are substantial. I'll cover many of them. Fossil fuel use. This natural gas is a fossil fuel. One of the types of fuels that causes so much climate change and is a real problem for us. And the last thing to think of is global warming, because the methane produced to go into gas stoves is a huge contributor to global warming. And again, I'll cover that in a few minutes. What I want you to do is I want you to think of air pollution from gas appliances as being analogous to passive smoking. I did some early work on some of the first studies on passive smoking at a time when we didn't realize all of the health effects of passive smoking. Passive smoking was once thought to be harmless. I know that many of you on this call can remember a time when we could smoke at work, even if we were in a cubicle. We could smoke in bars, in restaurants. We could even smoke on airplanes. We had the non-smoking area and the smoking area. And now we think, well, wow, that was crazy. We realize it's, quite a different situation with passive smoking than we once thought. What happened was research findings documented the harms. And after they did that, it was then recognized scientifically as a significant risk, passive smoking. But there was a lag time between the findings and the action to reduce the risk. That is, it took years after we started finding that there were health risks to really having strong action to prevent people from exposure to passive smoking. But it did happen. Well, let's go look at the same things for indoor air pollution with gas. Once thought of as harmless. And frankly, I would roll back 2 or 3 years and I would have thought it's pretty harmless. But we have new information showing it's significantly harmful. And many of you, this might be your first introduction to the fact that gas appliances and the pollution caused by them is causing health problems. Research findings have been very good at documenting the harms related to air pollution from gas appliances. It's now recognized scientifically as a significant risk factor for many different types of diseases. And here we are now. There is, again, going to be a lag time between the scientific findings and the action to reduce the risk. We're at the early stages of this with gas stoves, but we need to make people aware of the significant risks there are and to take action related to that. Okay, well, what are these pollutants that we have from gas stoves? Well, there's a number of them. Nitrogen dioxide is one. Carbon monoxide is another. And particulate matter, fine and ultrafine particulate matter. Let me cover each one of these individually. Nitrogen dioxide is a gas that is caused by burning fossil fuels and igniting your stove. If it's gas, it contributes to asthma development and aggravation. There are lots of anecdotal examples of people who, will report, gee, well, I remember when before I had my induction cooktop or my electric cooktop, I used to have a lot more asthma episodes when I was cooking. Never could kind of figure out why that was. Was it the spices they were cooking or the onions or whatever? Well, it's probably the pollutants coming from cooking that were doing that, making their asthma worse. Increased susceptibility to respiratory infections, pneumonia, and other infections, and a negative effect on general cognitive function, your general ability to think clearly. And you might not realize it, but maybe this indoor air pollution has caused you just to be not have quite the edge you would otherwise. Okay, carbon monoxide. Well, we've all heard of carbon monoxide poisoning and people dying from carbon monoxide poisoning, but it doesn't have to get to the point where it's killing you to cause effects. There are many neurologic effects from low doses of carbon monoxide. There's fatigue, impaired vision, reduced brain function, brain fog, dizziness, confusion, nausea, coma even if it gets very severe and high levels. And again, an increased risk of infections, pneumonias and other infections from carbon monoxide at lower levels. And again, reduced overall cognitive function, just not being able to think quite as clearly with these pollutants in the air. And the third category is fine and ultrafine particulate matter. This is kind of analogous to what comes off the end of a cigarette smoke. It's things that are very, very fine, very small particles that get into your lungs and actually get into your blood as well. They cause neurologic effects, the fatigue, memory disturbance, loss of concentration and judgment. They again aggravate asthma and reduce lung function. Also contribute to heart attacks and premature death. How do they do that? They get into the lung and they get across the capillary barrier in the lungs and get from the airways into your blood. And from there, they circulate. They circulate to all different places, your heart, your brain, and they cause problems in those areas. So that's a significant issue that can cause major problems. Well, let's look at how much of a problem this is with nitrogen dioxide. So here you have the outdoor standard for nitrogen dioxide. Okay, it was established by the EPA, a national standard. And you can see over here, 1 hour average, 100 parts per billion. So keep that in mind. This is the outdoor air, not the indoor air standard, but the outdoor air standard. Well, let's look what happens when you start cooking in your home. You'll see this here on the left side, this red line is in the kitchen. It's the level of nitrogen dioxide at baseline before one starts cooking. But look what happens when you start cooking. It shoots up very quickly to a very high level. And again, you remember that 100 from the previous slide? This 100 is the limit of what the EPA says is acceptable for outdoor air quality. Well, this is indoor air quality, so that's something you need to be even more concerned about. So now look, you stop cooking, and what happens? It goes down, but it does not go down that quickly. It stays very high and stays high over time. Then you start cooking again, it shoots right back up. Again, above the level that's acceptable in outdoor air quality, and then goes down, shoots up again when you start cooking, and then goes down slowly. But here's something really important. See this blue line here? This is the bedroom concentrations. So look at what the concentrations are in the bedroom and how they stay high as well with the cooking. So it's not just isolated to the kitchen. This gets all over your house and can cause problems, not just for those cooking, but those in all areas. The vulnerable population is children. They have high breathing rates and a lot of physical activity. They have a high lung surface to body ratio, and they have immature respiratory systems. So children, we need to be particularly careful about having them in a kitchen around gas cooking. Well, that's natural gases and cooking stoves implications for us personally and our health. How about our planet's health? Well, there are significant effects on our planet as well. Natural gas is primarily methane. Those terms are used interchangeably a lot of times, and methane is the primary component in natural gas. Methane is a huge contributor to climate change. It is 86 times more warming than CO2. So if you have a little bit of that methane leaking from your stove or the pipelines coming to your house from the wells, then it's a huge contributor to climate change and is just a major factor that we need to be aware of. Sources of methane related to home appliances, well, it can come from gas wells, leaks at gas wells where they get the methane to begin with, or the gathering pipes, the compressor station, transmission pipelines, decompression gates, all these different places. Then you get to your residential gas lines, which may be leaking. Residential appliances, all of these are sources where methane can be leaked into the atmosphere and can be 86 times more powerful than CO2, the most common greenhouse gas. So this is a significant issue and problem and a major contributor to climate change. Methane pollution is responsible for about half of the Earth's warming today. Now, that's not all from gas stoves, but methane, it shows you methane is a huge contributor to climate change and one we need to be aware of. Okay, so again, what should come to your mind when you think of gas stoves? Not those other things that I told you before in terms of the good things, but what should come to mind? Indoor air pollution, health risks, fossil fuel, and global warming. These are the things we need to be associate with the thought of gas appliances in our homes. So thank you. Take any questions that you have. And let me stop sharing my screen now.
So I have a question for you as we get some in the chat. I'm curious about how, if at all, these emissions are affected by if you have, a really good range hood on your stove that has, an exhaust and is pulling air out with a fan. And then I'm also curious if, sometimes I heat the oil too much to its smoke point and it's going to turn into smoke and go out in the house. If that kind of the cooking emissions that aren't from burning the gas, but are actually from the cooking of the food, is that relevant to these air pollution things that you're talking about?
No, well, the studies that were done just on the cooking. They didn't cook things, and the things that were being cooked created that effect. This was just turning the stove on or turning the range on or whatever. Yeah, so that was that's how they did that.
Yeah, and in terms of like having a fan.
Oh yeah, the
going or a
cooktop.
hood, does that matter?
Anything you can do to vent your house is beneficial. So if you can open a window, that's better. If you can turn a fan on in the kitchen or vent fan, that's great. If you can turn a fan on in the bedroom, that will help, or the bathroom, that will help. Anything to get the air circulating. Also, you can cook on the back burner rather than the front burner. Then the fumes are not coming directly into your face and your nose. That's basically, those are the kind of key things, but you can definitely reduce the hazards substantially. And any way you can ventilate will reduce the problem.
Great.
But not eliminate.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any other questions that have come in the chat. Feel free to ask anything if anything comes up. But I will go back to my presentation and we'll talk about now, if you have a little bit more motivation to get induction to your house, this is super important safety stuff, how you can actually get these pieces of equipment and install them. So let me just get set up here so that I can see the chat. Okay, great. So in terms of installing induction in your house, we've discussed this a little bit earlier, but you have basically two versions. You can have, an actual range or range top. You can even have a full unit that has an oven in it, or you can have a sort of portable unit. These are like the types that Acterra and lots of other programs can lend you if you're curious about trying induction, and I'll get to that a little bit later. So in terms of the cost profile, you can also get, wouldn't necessarily recommend this for all the reasons we just discussed. You can get a partial unit that will cover like half of your stove and give you some induction. There are some mixed fuel things that I'll talk about later. So one of those I have here on the left, which is a 12-inch wide 2-burner one. This is a very high-end model with like a lot of fancy controls and electronics and really high power. It's going to cost $1,600. So that's maybe going to make it seem like this is incredibly expensive, but actually there's a huge range, as there is with any kind of stove. On the top here, there's a 5-burner one that's 3 times as wide, 36 inches, has this central burner that's very high power. And this you can get for only $370, not counting the installation costs, of course. There are lots of places will have sales, will have discounts, lots of things offer rebates that I'll talk about later. But there is a huge price range. There's a huge sort of feature and power range. Because these things are controlled electronically, you can get things that have timers and more complicated sensors and various interesting things you can do. All of them have a type of sensor that will turn itself off if it realizes there isn't a pan on top of it that's accepting the power. So all of them have a certain level of safety features and things like that, which are really excellent. But there is a big variety in terms of what exactly you can get. Then you can get, so in terms of installing these things, there are some challenges. So often, almost always, especially if you have a big unit, they're going to require a 220 volt outlet. And unless you already have a kitchen that's set up to have an electric oven, there may not be a 220 volt outlet nearby. So you may have to do some rewiring. It's even possible that you might need to do a panel upgrade to get the additional amperage to feed the electric stovetop, although they don't take so much power compared to some other electric appliances. It is possible to get one that replaces your existing stovetop often. It's possible to get one that can go on an existing counter. You kind of just have to find out what your exact setup is and maybe talk to some contractors and figure out what's going on. if you get an induction range that has an oven, it's going to be an electric oven. Sometimes people ask, is there such a thing as an induction oven? There isn't, because induction is about the way that we're heating metal instead of air. But the point of an oven is that you're heating the air. So an oven is always going to be an electric oven is always going to use electric resistance, just in a heating coil or a heating line. And those can be very good and work perfectly well. Some of you may have used them. And then, like I mentioned, there are some dual fuel units, but we wouldn't necessarily encourage that. It looks like some people are talking about their experience with installation and with scratches in the chat. That's great. If you have any other experience you want to put in there, go ahead. So the other alternative here, especially for people who, maybe you live in multifamily housing and you don't have control over what your stove is. Maybe you don't have the money for a total replacement. Maybe you don't even already have a gas stove, but you want to try out induction. There are these countertop units, which can run from about $80 to about $300. These will plug into a normal wall outlet, 110 volts. They have a single burner. Some of them have 2 burners. And they basically work just as well as the range units, except that often they have a lower, highest possible power. So for a really massive dish with a lot of food that you want a lot of heat going into, might not work. But for most aspects of everyday cooking, these work really well. Cooktop and New Wave are 2 of the companies that have kind of specialized in this. But there are a lot of other electronics and or kind of cooking supplies companies that have their own model of the countertop unit. So you can look around, and there are lots of these things, and you can even get one to borrow from a bunch of different people have lending programs if you're curious about trying one out. So in terms of challenges when you're thinking about these as well, you have access to 220 volts, you have rewiring and panel upgrades, whether or not it'll integrate with your existing oven, if you're having a full range. Of course, if you're trying to do some kind of work in here in multifamily housing, you may have trouble getting permission from your landlord. So that is a huge challenge, and I think something that people are working on in the space of how to make it more accessible for people in multifamily housing, since that's a huge fraction of the Bay Area, including me. I use a countertop unit. I have a gas stove in my apartment that I don't know how to get switched out because I'm not the property owner. And then the last thing to be aware of is ventilation for the countertop units. So I'm just talking about cooking fumes, none of the pollution from burning, obviously, because it's an induction unit. But I was seasoning a wok on my own little countertop unit, and I heated it up to the smoke point and made all of this smoke. And I realized, like, oh, this isn't under a range hood, and I'm just totally smoking up the kitchen. So if you're doing a high heat, high smoke point cooking, in your kitchen with one of these countertop units that isn't going to have a ventilation hood over it, you want to be really careful and making sure that your windows are open and you have a fan on. I know this from personal experience. That's super important. Okay, let me look for a moment at the chat. So let's see. So we have, how do these look after use? Do they get scratched up? Most of them have a pretty solid surface that isn't going to get scratched up by putting on the pan or moving it around. That kind of, even with heavy pans, they're well designed for this. I'm sure there are cases where they get scratched, but usually you can wipe them down after using them and keep them clean, and they'll look great for years. For the person who asked what is a wok burner, you can get a particular type of burner that works for a round-bottomed wok, which wouldn't normally work on these flat induction units. I talked about it a little earlier. I'll talk about it a little more at the end if we have time, or you can go back and look at the recording. Thank you so much to Susan for sharing your lessons from installation. That's great. And then we have a question about, if you're to use a countertop one while leaving your gas stove in, is there a risk of emission leaks from the gas cooktop? The answer is yes. There is low levels of methane and fossil gas leaking out of your stove at all times, but it's not going to be as high as those graphs that Dr. Martin was showing earlier and have that really severe health risk. You're not going to have those other chemicals like carbon monoxide and nitrogen dioxide because you're not burning it. But it isn't so good for the climate in the sense that you still have a methane pipe running in your house that's going to leak a little bit. Susan also mentions, the costs that I have here don't include the cost of installation, which can be high, especially if you need some kind of rewiring. Oh, and the other challenge that I didn't mention here is you may have to buy some new pans. This is something that I am interested in. There are some programs that are looking at rebates and subsidies for getting the induction cooktop, but not really a lot of programs that have rebates or subsidies if you need to buy a bunch of new pans. So if you're involved with sustainability organizations, or your municipality, and you yourself or anyone you know has trouble getting the pans to switch to induction, I think that's an interesting thing to explore in terms of the future of these kinds of programs. Question is, how do you get the wok burner installed on one of these cooktops, or do you also have to get a countertop one? So the wok burners are sort of a separate unit from the flat ones. You can get a range that has both. You can get a countertop installation that's only a wok unit. You can get just a plug-in one that's only a wok unit. There's kind of a lot of different options, and some of the vendors sell a modular stove. And that's a great point about if you're not using your gas, then you can do the shut off into your house and then they won't leak as much. There's a question, do cast iron work on induction? Yes, cast iron is kind of the simplest, most straightforward thing to use on induction. It's all iron. It definitely works. Okay, and then we have a question about us looking for a specific model for a 24-inch wide one. I won't get into that now, but I'll recommend some sort of people that you can contact in a moment in terms of contractors and websites that might know more. Actually, that's right now. So let's say you're getting one of these and you want to make it a little cheaper. The main resource, if you live in the Bay Area, is the Bay Area Regional Energy Network. They're a great resource to look at. If you're in PG&E or community choice aggregator territory, you can use them. They're a great resource for all kinds of home electrification things. They have a really robust contractor network. They have a ton of rebates for things like heat pump water heaters and panel upgrades. They have this $750 rebate on an induction range upgrade if you are replacing the existing gas. It's not going to work if you want to just get a countertop unit, a plug-in unit that you're going next to the gas. But as long as you're taking that gas stove out, you can get this $750 rebates. Then there are a couple of other programs to be aware of. You'll hear from Peninsula Clean Energy shortly, but Silicon Valley Clean Energy also has their own contractor network for lots of work. And then if you happen to be working in a commercial kitchen, East Bay Community Energy for Alameda County, they'll give you a very large rebate if you're trying to electrify the whole commercial kitchen, which is a really exciting thing to be working on. So those are all things to be aware of. And then we have a couple of programs at Acterra that you might be interested in if you're curious about induction. So if you live in Alameda County or the city of Tracy, you can apply for our induction cooktop loan program, which is in partnership with East Bay Community Energy. Here are the links, and you'll get this kit right here that there's a picture of, which has a bag, which has an instruction card, it has a few recipes. It comes with a compatible pan. So if you don't have a compatible pan, you'll be able to use ours, but you can also try to use your own pan. And it has this Winco countertop, induction thing, plugs into 110 volt. And so you can borrow one for, it's about 4 weeks. The loan term varies a little bit depending on when you pick it up. It's totally free. And there's a lot of different sites in Alameda County where you could pick one up. So highly recommend if you're in Alameda County, you check that out. We also have a smaller loan program that's based out of Palo Alto. That one has a kind of high wait list and a little bit of a slow time. But if you go to our website, if you're near Palo Alto, you might be able to sign up for that as well. And then we also have a cooking class twice a month where you can just see a professional chef cook on induction and cook along if you want to. It's also a plant-based cooking class since Acterra has some programming around plant-based eating. And you're welcome to sit in and just see what somebody cooks on induction. And it's often funny when people come because it just looks like the cooking that you're used to. There's not a lot of wild new techniques that you need to learn if you're just cooking a kind of standard meal. But that's always a fun thing to go to. And they're usually on a Tuesday and then on a Thursday. We actually have one tomorrow, which you can still sign up for if you'd like to. So you can go to acterra.org/induction. So that's all of the programming I wanted to tell you about. But we also have Vanessa Shin from Peninsula Clean Energy here to tell you a little bit about their organization and their programs. So Vanessa, I'll pass it over to you now.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Leo, the Acterra team, as well as Dr. Martin and the folks from Physicians for Social Responsibility for all of your education today. I'm learning so much from you all as well from the chat. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about Peninsula Clean Energy. I'll be brief. Next slide, since think many of you are probably already familiar with us, but the things that you need to know is that we are a public agency. We were launched in 2016 with the vision to build a sustainable world with clean energy for everyone. And how we do that is that we purchase 100% clean energy from sources like wind farms or big solar arrays on the behalf of our customers. We serve San Mateo County and the city of Los Banos. And it's likely that if you don't live in our area, you are served by an organization like ours. Next slide, please. Wanted to highlight some exciting community benefits. We provide not only cleaner electricity, but also at a lower cost compared to PG&E. And for the average customer, that comes to about savings of a few extra dollars each month. But when you think about our entire customer base, see that we've saved our customers over $100 million since we launched. Another exciting way that our customers are supporting local climate action is that they've helped reduce our emissions from electricity by 96% since our launch. And since we have such a clean source of energy, we're helping to support our communities with transitioning to stop using fossil fuels in the home and use electricity instead. Next slide, please. And so the main resource that I'd like to share with you all today is our webpage online with information about induction cooking. The one that I'd like to highlight is a cooking tutorial by Chef Mark Dwessler of the Food Service Technology Center, and he will show you how to make the perfect chocolate banana crepe. And so I'll put a link in the chat, but encourage you all to check that out. I'm super excited for Acterra's cooking demonstrations as well. And so, yeah, it's a great learning opportunity and you can learn how to make a nice dessert as well. And next slide. And that concludes my presentation. Happy to answer any questions, but it sounds like, yeah, you all might have more questions on the specific logistics of installing induction. So I will yield the floor back to Leo.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. And I highly recommend people go and check out the video of that workshop. Mark is really great because he both is a excellent chef, but also knows a ton about the technology itself and installation. So while he's cooking, he's really highlighting these different things that you might need to know, or if he's highlighting if he's doing anything differently because he's using induction, he can really access the aspects, the things that are good about having that fine control over the power going into the your food that you're cooking. So great video if you're curious and want to see something more. I have one more thing that I want to share with everybody, which is a little bit unrelated to what we've been talking about, but it's still super important to know about as we're in the last few months of summer. So we are trying to, at Acterra, are trying to get basically everybody that we interact with to sign up for Power Saver rewards. So this is an sort of collaboration across all of the utilities in California. And we have these extreme heat days where, or kind of days in general, where there's some problem with some aspect of the grid and tons of people are using tons of electricity and there's a possibility for brownouts. This is different from the public safety power shutoffs because of the fires. It's a slightly different thing. It's more about kind of overloading the grid because so many people are using so much power and there might be a problem somewhere else in the grid. So what they're asking people to do is basically just sign up, and it's possible that you're going to get an alert from the utility at some point that says, oh, we're coming up on one of these days, and we want you to try to reduce your power consumption today, especially in the evening when the grid is the most taxed. So they'll actually ask you to do stuff like turn on your air conditioning earlier in the day before 4 p.m. and the grid is so taxed to sort of pre-cool your home, and so you can turn it off after 4 p.m. Make sure you're not using major appliances like a washing machine or a dishwasher in that 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. slot, and just be able to react so that we don't have any of these brownouts and we don't have the grid get overloaded on these really extreme heat days as we're working on upgrading the grid. So really highly recommend you go to their website, powersaverrewards.org, and sign up. And they have an incentive where if you do sign up, you can get benefit on your utility bill. If you participate in these flex alerts and you end up reducing your power, you'll sort of get an additional reduction in the charge against you. The way they have it is a little bit complicated, but there's some possibility for you to kind of get a little bit of savings back if you participate and are able to reduce your power use. And this kind of thing where we're reacting to the strain in the grid is going to be really important as we're electrifying And as we're consuming more and more electricity, obviously people are working very hard on grid modernization and making sure that we don't have all of these problems. But we're also asking everyone to be switching from gas to electric on lots of appliances. And so there's going to be new sources of strain that the grid is going to adapt to. So kind of being clued in to just overall, when does the grid need help and how can I reduce my electrical load on the grid by doing things at the right time is a really important thing for anybody who cares about avoiding emissions to be thinking about. So we are right at time at 7. I am going to stay on and answer some more questions if anyone has any, but you should feel free to hop off if you need to. I'm really glad that so many of you were here and were able to stay the whole time and had so many great questions in the chat. And we will have another series of workshops coming later in the fall. We do 4 workshops, one on heat pump water heaters, one on rooftop solar, one on electric vehicle charging, and one on induction cooktops. And so we'll have all 4 of those again in the fall. We're actually thinking about expanding that and adding one about central heating and AC, and maybe also figuring out if we can get something about e-bikes in there too, because we're excited about that. So if you are interested in those, definitely follow Acterra. If there's something you really want to know about and you'd love for us to do a workshop on, we'd love to get emails from you and requests. And really glad that you were all here. Huge thank you to Vanessa and Mike for your presentations and to Peninsula Clean Energy for your support. Really great to have you presenting here. And I think that's it. So I will read the chat again and just make sure there's no last questions. But thank you all so much. Okay, so scrolling up a bit. All right, we had one from a while ago about there are units that have the ventilation built in. I'm not sure exactly what you mean like that, if there's some ventilation that's distinct from having this sort of normal hood above the stove. There are definitely ones that have that. I don't know if there's any other kind of built-in exhaust. Also, one thing to be aware of is that induction, especially the countertop units, they have an internal fan that's kind of keeping the electronics underneath the pan itself cool. So they have that going on, which is kind of unrelated from the ventilation, but it's sort of an interesting thing about it. And some of those countertop units will make a little bit of a fan noise. It's not very loud, but if you're not expecting it, it can be a little strange. Actually, and since I'm talking about that fan and the surface underneath, sometimes you hear from people that the countertop surface under the induction pan actually stays cold because all of the heat is going directly into the pan. And while that sounds very exciting, it's completely untrue. I don't know why anybody says that. The heat isn't being generated in the countertop, of course, but you have a hot pan sitting on top of it. So of course it gets hot because there's a hot pan that you're cooking with sitting right on top of it. So if someone tells you to, take off your super hot pan that you're boiling water in and put your hand right on that surface, you're not going to be happy about it. It's going to cool off much faster than your burner would for another type of stove because it's not a big, metal piece that's holding heat, but it does get hot because there's a hot pan on top of it. We have resources being shared. I think someone was asking about induction versus microwave and other radiation. So the way that this heats is totally different from microwave radiation. That's a totally different wavelength and speed that's interacting with water instead of interacting with metal. And it doesn't have sort of the same kind of effects on the things that are around it as microwave does. Yeah, you can look at the recording earlier in the presentation for how it works specifically, but it's about 110 hertz frequency or something like that, maybe a little higher frequency compared to microwave, which is way faster than radio waves. Oh, and someone answered that as well. Uses the same frequencies as your audio speakers, and the range is extremely limited. Yeah, and similarly, Cora is mentioning that when you lift off the pan, the burner immediately turns off. It's not going to be able, you can't like hold your pan above it and have it get heated because it's super limited range right above that coil. Okay, any last questions? I'll give a few seconds for anybody to add any last questions, and after that, I'll stop the recording and close this out. Resources for getting a cutout expanded to fit a new cooktop. I don't have anything in particular to recommend for you. It sounds like that might be specific enough that you might want to talk to some contractors, but it's possible that if you get some kind of home audit through Bayren or talk to someone who's an expert, they might know they might know the specific thing that you need done, and whether that happens enough with induction. There might be contractors that are experts in both, but I'm not totally sure about that one. All right, I think I will close us out. reminder to those great links that Vanessa and Dr. Martin put in the chat. You should go and check out their work. And again, we have a cooking class tomorrow. If this got you really excited about seeing someone cook on induction, you can sign up for that on Acterra's website. And I really hope the rest of you have a great night. Thank you so much for being here.